Elian stood at the center of the marketplace, the midday sun casting no shadows around him, yet a profound darkness seemed to coil tightly within his chest. He held a heavy leather pouch in his right hand. The crowd parted for him, not out of fear, but out of a reverence that bordered on worship. They whispered his name as he passed: Elian the righteous, Elian the keeper of the law, Elian, the man who had never stumbled. He approached the stone treasury with the deliberate, graceful movements of a man who knew he was being watched. He did not throw the coins, he poured them. The sound of silver striking silver rang out like a bell, silencing the murmurs of the beggars and the merchants nearby. He closed his eyes, tilting his head slightly toward the heavens, muttering a prayer that was loud enough to be heard by the elders standing in the shade of the colonnade, but soft enough to seem humble. Father, I thank you that I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers. I fast, I give, I obey. A collective sigh of admiration rippled through the onlookers. A woman reached out to touch the hem of his expensive robe, but he pulled away instinctively, a flash of cold irritation crossing his eyes before he masked it with a practiced, benevolent smile. He did not like to be touched. Touch was dangerous. Touch left evidence. Elian turned and walked toward the upper city, his heart beating a steady, hollow rhythm against his ribs. The praise of the crowd usually filled him, acting as a narcotic that numbed the gnawing anxiety in his gut. But today the numbness was wearing off too quickly. The terrified child inside him was scratching at the walls of the composed man he presented to the world. He reached the heavy iron gates of his estate. His head servant, Malchus, was waiting, bowing low as the master entered. Malchus began to speak about the shipment of spices from the east and the profits from the olive groves, but Elian raised a hand, cutting the air and the conversation. "Do not disturb me for the rest of the evening," Elian commanded, his voice tight. "I must study the Torah. I must pray. Your support shines a light on the stories that history often hides. Hit like and subscribe to help us reveal the truths that others are too afraid to speak. And don't look away, because you are about to discover that the most dangerous secrets aren't the ones we keep from the world, but the ones we keep from God." Malchus nodded, stepping back into the shadows. Elian walked through the main hall, ignoring the expensive tapestries and the smell of roasting lamb wafting from the kitchens. He climbed the stairs to his private chambers. He locked the main door. Then, he crossed the room to a section of the wall covered by a hanging woven with images of prophets. He pushed the fabric aside. Behind it was a smaller, reinforced door. This was the room no servant knew about. This was the room that did not exist on the architectural plans of the house. Elian took a small, intricate key from a chain hidden beneath his tunic, resting against his skin. His hands, which had been steady while pouring coins in the temple, now trembled violently. He unlocked the door and stepped into the suffocating silence of his secret. The room was small, smelling of stale air and dried lavender. It was not a place of prayer. It was a museum of his hidden life. On a small table lay a collection of letters written on expensive papyrus, bound with a crimson ribbon. Next to them was a small pagan statue made of obsidian, a gift from a Roman lover he had sworn to the priests he had never met, and beside that, a ledger. Not the ledger he showed the tax collectors or the temple authorities, but the real ledger, the one that detailed the ruthless debts he collected, the widows he had evicted to expand his estate, and the bribes he paid to keep his reputation spotless. Elian sat on the single wooden stool, his breathing shallow. He reached for the letters. He knew he should burn them. Every day, the law of Moses screamed in his head that he should burn them and shatter the idol, but he could not. These sins were his treasures. They were the only things in his life that felt real, the only things that were not a performance. He opened one of the letters, tracing the handwriting of the woman who was the wife of a Roman centurion. Their affair was a capital offense, a treason against his people, and a violation of God's law. If anyone found this, the stones would fly. His perfection would shatter. He would be dragged outside the city walls and executed. The thrill of that danger mixed with his shame. He whispered into the dark room, his voice cracking, "My heart is yours, God." But the words died in the air. He was lying. He knew it. God was in the temple. God was in the tithes. But God was not allowed in this room. This room belonged to Elian. He sat there for hours, guarding his filth, terrified that the God he claimed to serve might one day kick down the door and demand to see what was truly on the throne of his heart. News traveled through the city like a fever. They said the Nazarene was near. They said he was a teacher who spoke with an authority that made the scribes look like stuttering children. They said he healed the sick and, more disturbingly, he forgave sins. Elian heard the rumors in the marketplace the next morning. His first instinct was mockery. Another false Messiah, he thought. Another peasant stirring up the rabble. But then he heard the whispers about the man's eyes. People said that when the Nazarene looked at you, he did not see your clothes or your rank. He saw the bone and the marrow. He saw the secrets. A cold spike of fear drove into Elian's stomach. If this man could see secrets, Elian had to know. He had to test him. He had to prove that his own armor of righteousness was impenetrable. If he could stand before this prophet and be validated, then perhaps the voice of accusation in his secret room would finally be silenced. He needed a stamp of approval from the highest authority to soothe his conscience. Elian found the crowd gathered near the southern gates. The mass of people was thick, a wall of sweating bodies and desperate voices. Under normal circumstances, Elian would never lower himself to push through such a mob. But the desperation seizing him was stronger than his dignity. He used his elbows, his expensive cloak acting as a shield. People recognized him and moved aside, murmuring, "Make way for the Master. Make way for the Righteous One." He broke through the inner circle and saw him. Jesus was sitting on a low stone wall, blessing a child. He looked ordinary. His robe was dusty, his hands rough like a worker's hands. There was no halo, no glowing aura, nothing that signaled divinity. Elian felt a surge of confidence. This was just a man. He could handle a man. Elian smoothed his tunic, composed his face into a mask of earnest piety, and ran forward. He fell on his knees in the dirt, a calculated theatrical gesture. "Good teacher," Elian cried out, his voice ringing clear over the noise of the crowd. "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" The crowd went silent. It was a perfect question from a perfect man. Elian waited for the praise. He waited for the teacher to point to him and say, "Look at this man. Follow his example." Jesus turned slowly, his eyes locked onto Elian's. The world seemed to tilt. The noise of the city faded into a dull roar. Elian felt stripped naked. Those eyes were not judging, they were knowing. It was as if Jesus had walked right past the kneeling Elian, through the gates of his estate, up the stairs, and was standing inside the locked room, looking at the obsidian idol and the letters. "Why do you call me good?" Jesus asked calmly. "No one is good except God alone." Elian swallowed hard. The deflection threw him off balance. "You know the commandments," Jesus continued, his voice steady, reciting the ancient laws. "Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal, do not bear false witness, do not defraud, honor your father and mother." Elian exhaled. This was safe ground. This was the performance he had mastered since childhood. He raised his head, confidence returning. He had managed his external life perfectly. He had never physically murdered. He had never been caught stealing. "Teacher," Elian declared, a smile touching his lips, "all these I have kept from my youth." He waited for the validation. He waited for the gold star. But Jesus did not applaud. The text of the moment shifted. Jesus looked at him and loved him. Elian flinched. He expected admiration. He expected challenge, but he did not expect love. It was a terrifying, searing love that burned through his defenses. It was a love that said, "I see the lie, and I want the liar." It was a love that demanded intimacy, not performance. Then came the words that would haunt Elian for the rest of his life. "You lack one thing." Elian froze. One thing? He was perfect. He was the standard. "Go, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush bones. The command was not about money. Elian knew that instantly. It was about the throne. His wealth was his shield. His wealth was the lock on the secret room. His money bought the silence of his servants. His money bribed the officials who might expose his affair. His money maintained the image that kept him safe. If he sold everything, he would be vulnerable. He would be just a man. He would have no walls left to hide behind. Jesus was asking for the keys to the forbidden room. He was saying, "I will not be a guest in your house while you worship another master in the dark." Elian looked at the dusty feet of the teacher. Then he looked at the crowd. He thought of the obsidian statue. He thought of the touch of the Roman woman. He thought of the power he held when he walked into the temple. The cost was too high. The surgery was too radical. He wanted salvation, but not if it meant surrender. He wanted God, but he wanted his secrets more. Elian stood up slowly. His face, usually bright with false holiness, fell. The color drained from his skin. Sorrow, deep and heavy, washed over him. He could not do it. He could not dethrone the idol of self-protection. He turned his back on the Son of God. He did not run. He walked away, step by heavy step, clutching the pouch of money at his belt as if it were a lifeline, while his soul screamed that he was holding a stone that would drag him to the bottom of the sea. Behind him, the teacher watched him go, and the tragedy was not that Elian was rejected, but that he was invited, and he chose the lock instead of the key. The first crack had appeared in the porcelain mask of his life, and Elian knew, with a terrifying certainty, that everything he had built was beginning to rot from the inside out. Elian returned to his deserted estate, the silence more condemning than any spoken accusation. He did not go to the secret room this time, nor did he go to the library. He stood motionless in the center of the main hall, staring at the polished stone floor, seeing not his own reflection, but the magnified, shadow-laden image of his Father. He had expected the teacher to offer him a list of good deeds, a set of instructions that would validate his efforts. Instead, Jesus had exposed the root of his spiritual disease, the worship of security, the fear of vulnerability, the absolute refusal to surrender control. And control, Elian realized, was the single, poisonous inheritance of his youth. His father, a stern and ruthlessly efficient man, whose face rarely broke into a smile, had ruled their household with an iron fist disguised in silk gloves. Love was not a gift, it was a wage. Approval was not a comfort, it was a transaction. Elian remembered the day he had accidentally broken a precious clay tablet inscribed with family history. He was only 5 years old. His father hadn't beaten him. He had simply looked at the boy with an expression of profound, cold disappointment, saying quietly, "You are weak, Elian. You are incapable of holding value. If you cannot be perfect, you will be worthless." That sentence had become the foundation upon which Elian built his entire life. Perfection was the shield. Achievement was the currency of survival. To be seen as perfect by his community, to amass wealth that promised untouchability, to master the law better than the masters themselves, all of it was a frantic, lifelong effort to erase the image of that disappointed, contemptuous face. And now, this teacher, this Nazarene, was asking him to hand over the control, to cast aside the shield, to step off the meticulously crafted pedestal of perfection, and simply trust. How could he? In Elian's terrified, unexamined heart, the image of the Heavenly Father was a mirror of the earthly one. He believed that God was watching, judging, and waiting for the first sign of weakness to withdraw his favor and utter the devastating sentence, "You are worthless." Elian had always viewed his spirituality as a contract, not a covenant. He kept his side of the bargain, the fasting, the tithing, the outward purity, to ensure God kept his protection, prosperity, and eternal life. His secret sins, the forbidden room, were simply the private fees he paid to himself to manage the overwhelming pressure of the contract. He needed to be able to breathe outside the strictures of his performed perfection. If he surrendered everything, if he truly confessed the ugly truth of the hidden ledger and the illicit letters, he believed God would not offer mercy. God would seize the opportunity to shame him, to confirm his Father's verdict, and to abandon him to the merciless judgment of the public. Fathers leave, fathers punish. Fathers only love the image of what they wanted you to be. Elian knew the words of the prophets about God's compassion, but those were merely words on parchment. His nervous system, his deepest instincts, had been trained by the harsh reality of human fatherhood, and so the spiritual crisis was revealed as a deeply personal, psychological wound. He could not fully give his heart to a father he secretly expected to hurt him, ignore him, or leave him the moment he showed his true, flawed face. The veil was woven not just from sin, but from fear. The following evening, consumed by intellectual terror, Elian sought counsel from Rabbi Nathan, a respected elder and scholar known for his deep, even brutal, honesty regarding the ancient texts. Elian did not dare confess his encounter with Jesus or his own secret sins. He approached the matter obliquely. "Rabbi," Elian began, speaking with the measured tone of a seeker of wisdom, "how does one truly reconcile the glorious righteousness of God with the profound, constant failure of man?" Rabbi Nathan, a man whose eyes seemed to hold the dust of centuries, looked at Elian with an unsettling intensity. "Your question, my son, is the central dilemma of all the ages. But you ask the question as a man seeking escape, not truth." Elian stiffened, but held his composure. "Tell me, Rabbi, about the heart that God desires. Does he desire the polished performance?" The rabbi snorted, a dry, dismissive sound. "Performance? The Almighty cares nothing for your posture on the steps of the treasury, Elian. He desires reality. Do you know the story of David, the man God called a man after my own heart?" Elian nodded, ready to hear the story of the mighty king who slew Goliath. "No," the rabbi interrupted, sensing Elian's expectation. "Do not speak to me of the boy with the sling. Speak to me of the man on the rooftop, the man who saw the wife of his neighbor, took her, and then had her husband deliberately sacrificed on the battlefield to bury his shame." The rabbi leaned forward, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "That is the heart of man, Elian. It is filthy. It is entangled in lust, murder, and the arrogant belief that one can hide wickedness beneath the robes of royalty and the incense of religion." David tried to bury the evidence under layers of deceit, hoping his public piety would cover the stench of his private transgression. Elian felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead. The rabbi, though unaware of the secret room, was describing its contents with chilling precision. "What did David do when the prophet Nathan exposed him?" Elian asked, his voice barely audible. "He did not write a neat prayer," the rabbi hissed. "He did not offer an excuse. He did not promise to do better next time. His carefully constructed life, his throne, his achievements, his image fell into ruin. He brought his ruin to God. He cried out, 'Against you, you only, have I sinned and done what is evil in your sight.' He knew the performance was over. He confessed his ugliness." The rabbi's eyes pierced Elian's. His voice rose to a powerful crescendo, quoting the ancient psalm, "Create in me a clean heart, O God, and renew a right spirit within me." The rabbi paused, allowing the words to hang heavy in the air. "He is not asking God to polish the old heart, Elian. He is asking for an act of creation, a new thing entirely." David did not offer God his achievements. He offered God his collapse. That is the only real offering God ever truly accepts. Elian stumbled back, the blood rushing from his face. The rabbi's words were a direct echo of the teacher's demand: relinquish control. The path to a clean heart was not through diligent performance, but through utter, humiliating exposure. David's story was not a cautionary tale of sin, but a radical blueprint for surrender. But the chasm between intellectual acceptance and the terrifying act of bringing the crimson-bound letters into the light seemed too wide to cross. Elian was too proud to be ruined. Days turned into weeks. Elian could not forget the teacher's eyes, nor the rabbi's brutal clarity. He was caught in a paralyzing tension. His fear of God's judgment, the phantom of his earthly father, warred constantly with his newfound, terrifying knowledge of God's desire for his real heart. Unable to choose genuine surrender, Elian chose the path of professional religion. The word was spreading that the followers of the Nazarene, though their leader had been executed, were multiplying and gathering in small fellowships. Elian, with his reputation and wealth, was a valuable asset. He presented himself to the fledgling community in the most diplomatic way possible. "I have been deeply moved by the teacher's teachings on the law," Elian announced to the group of believers. "I wish to lend my resources and my knowledge of the scriptures to this new movement." The leaders, still raw with conviction and struggling to organize, welcomed him eagerly. Elian brought stability and respectability. He became a fixture in their meetings, praying with fervent eloquence, sharing his vast knowledge, and donating large sums of money. Elian had traded his old life of pure personal performance for a new life of corporate performance. He developed his church face, the version of himself that knew exactly when to smile, when to nod in deep spiritual agreement, and when to raise his hands in worship just high enough to seem dedicated without drawing undue attention. This was his new, more dangerous contract with the divine. He would give God his service, his reputation, and his financial support, he would be the perfect, consistent member of the community. In return, God was to bless his outer life, ensure his eternal security, and, most importantly, never, ever ask about the forbidden room. His inner language became filled with unspoken conditions. I will preach the truth, but don't ask me to live it entirely. I will support the poor, but my assets must remain untouchable. I will forgive others, but don't ask me to forgive myself for my secret sins. Elian was attempting to build a wall around his real self using the bricks of Christian service. One day, he overheard a leader, perhaps Peter, speaking about the principle of true surrender within the community. The speaker described how the members were laying down their possessions, sharing everything, and truly holding all things in common. It was an image of radical, total ownership transfer. Elian felt a moment of smug superiority. He had given much, but certainly not all. His reserve of wealth, his final line of defense, remained securely under his lock and key. He had successfully negotiated his way into the kingdom without having to sell the throne. He watched a couple, Ananias and Sapphira, approach the leaders. They had sold a piece of property and dramatically presented a pile of coins, claiming it was the full proceeds. Elian, cynical and calculating, instantly recognized the performance. They, too, had kept back a portion of the price. They wanted the full glory of surrender while retaining the safety of reservation. He waited for them to be praised. But what happened next was a seismic shock that shattered Elian's careful contract. The leader, Peter, looked at the man and said, "You have not lied to men but to God." In a chilling moment that defied rational explanation, Ananias fell dead. A few hours later, his wife, Sapphira, walked in, repeating the same lie. She, too, fell and died. Elian stood in the background, witnessing the scene of horror and reverence. The message was unmistakable and terrifying. God was not interested in the appearance of full surrender. He had exposed a lie spoken in the silence of the heart, an unspoken contract. Elian's spiritual contract, "I will serve, but do not touch my forbidden room," had just been voided by a demonstration of divine demand. The God he was attempting to manage with his service had just confirmed that he was not a contracting partner, he was Lord, and he demanded the true, unfiltered, unreserved heart. Elian, pale and trembling, realized he was not only guilty of secret sin, but guilty of a secret covenant that might cost him everything, including his life. Elian did not walk away from the bodies of Ananias and Sapphira. He fled. His legs moved with a mechanical stiffness, carrying him away from the assembly of believers, away from the terrifying gaze of Peter, and away from the presence that had just sucked the air out of the room. He did not stop until he was safely behind the heavy cedar doors of his own estate, gasping for breath as if he had run a marathon. He collapsed onto a bench in the hallway, his hands shaking so violently he could not unclasp his cloak. The horror he felt was not just for the two people who had died, it was the horror of a man looking into a mirror and seeing his own execution. "They died because they lied," he whispered to the empty air. "They died because they held back a part of the price while pretending to give it all." The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow. He was Ananias. For weeks, he had sat among the believers, nodding at their prayers, singing their hymns, and contributing his silver, all while the key to the secret room burned against his chest. He had played the part of the devoted convert perfectly. He had convinced the widows that he was a saint. He had convinced the apostles that he was a pillar of the community. He had almost convinced himself. But the God of Peter was not a God who could be managed. This God was a consuming fire who did not negotiate with liars. Elian began to pace the floor of his main hall. Panic, cold and sharp, clawed at his throat. If God killed Ananias for holding back money, what would he do to Elian for holding back a life? Elian was not just hiding coins. He was hiding treasonous letters, forbidden idols, and a heart that bowed to Rome in secret while praising Zion in public. He needed to secure his defenses. Paranoia set in. Every shadow looked like an accuser. Every servant looked like a spy. He called for Malchus, his head servant. When the old man appeared, Elian scrutinized him with wild, feverish eyes. "Has anyone been in the upper chambers?" Elian demanded, his voice cracking. "No, master," Malchus replied, confused by the aggression. "You have the only key." Elian dismissed him, but did not feel relieved. He spent the next 3 days in a state of suspended terror. He refused to go back to the gathering of the believers. He sent a messenger with a donation, a bribe to keep God away, but he did not dare present his face. He feared that if he stepped into the presence of the apostles again, the Holy Spirit would strike him dead on the threshold. His life became a prison of his own making. The church face he had crafted, the smile, the pious tilt of the head, the gentle tone felt like a mask made of lead, crushing his skull. He tried to pray, but the words turned to ash in his mouth. He could not say Father because he was terrified of the Father. He could not say Lord because he was still sitting on the throne of his own heart. He realized with a sinking dread that his pretense was no longer a shield, it was a target. The safety he had tried to buy with his religious performance had evaporated. He was walking on a tightrope over a pit, and the rope was beginning to fray. The blow did not come from heaven. It came from the earth, and it struck with the brutality of a hammer. 2 weeks had passed since the death of Ananias. Elian had convinced himself that if he simply stayed quiet, if he slowly distanced himself from the radical core of the movement while maintaining his reputation in the marketplace, he could survive. He believed his secret room was secure. He was wrong. It was a sweltering afternoon in the Jerusalem market. Elian was negotiating a large shipment of grain with a group of merchants. He felt a semblance of his old power returning. He was Elian the wealthy, Elian the shrewd. Then he saw a Roman soldier pushing through the crowd, flanked by 2 temple guards. They were not looking for a thief. They were looking for him. Behind them walked a man Elian knew well, Jared, a rival merchant whom Elian had outmaneuvered for years. Jared held something in his hand. It was not a weapon. It was a bundle of papyrus tied with a crimson ribbon. Elian's blood froze. He recognized the ribbon. It was from the secret room. How? The question screamed in his mind. Had Malchus betrayed him? Had he left the door unlocked in his panic? It did not matter. The nightmare was breathing in his face. Elian! Jared shouted, his voice dripping with triumphant venom. The crowd turned. The negotiations stopped. You stand here negotiating grain as a son of Israel, Jared announced, holding the letters high, while you bed with the wives of our oppressors and worship their stone gods in the dark. No, Elian whispered, reaching out a hand as if to stop the words physically. Jared untied the ribbon. He did not need to read the whole letter. He simply read the signature and the date. It was a letter from the wife of a centurion, detailing their illicit meetings and mocking the Jewish customs Elian pretended to uphold. The silence in the marketplace was absolute. It was followed by a roar of outrage. To the Jews, he was a traitor and a defiler of the law. To the Romans, he was a liability, a man who compromised the dignity of an officer's household. The temple guards stepped forward. Elian, son of Borak, you are summoned to the council to answer for charges of moral impurity and collaboration against the sanctity of the people. Elian looked at the faces around him. Men who had bowed to him yesterday now looked at him with revulsion. The mask was ripped away. The church face dissolved. The righteous merchant vanished. Standing there, in his expensive robes, was just a frightened, exposed liar. He was dragged away not in chains, but in shame. They did not imprison him immediately. They simply destroyed him. Over the next 48 hours, his world collapsed. His creditors called in every debt. His partners severed all contracts. The Roman authorities, wishing to avoid a scandal, quietly confiscated his primary assets as a penalty for disturbing the peace. He was released from questioning with his life, only because the Romans did not care enough to execute him, and the Jewish council wanted him to suffer the living death of ostracization. Elian returned to his estate, but it was no longer his. The foreclosure process had begun. He walked up the stairs to his private chambers. The door to the secret room had been smashed open. The obsidian idol lay shattered on the floor. The letters were gone. The room was empty. The secrets that had ruled him were gone, but they had taken his identity with them. He had protected that room to save his life, and in doing so, he had lost it. He stood in the wreckage of his false god, realizing he was destitute. He had no money. He had no reputation. He had no friends. And, he believed, he had no God. Elian fled the city before the sun rose the next morning. He could not bear the whispers. He could not bear the eyes of the beggars he used to ignore, who now looked at him with pity. He walked until his sandals wore thin, heading east toward the wilderness of Judea. The landscape changed from olive groves to jagged rocks and scorching dust. It was a place for wild beasts and demons, a place for men who wanted to die but were too cowardly to end it themselves. He found a small cave cut into the side of a limestone cliff, far from the road. He collapsed on the hard ground, his body dehydrated and aching. For the first day, he just lay there, numb. But as the thirst set in and the silence of the desert pressed against his ears, the numbness gave way to a boiling, volcanic rage. He crawled to the mouth of the cave and looked up at the relentless, burning blue sky. "Are you satisfied?" he croaked, his voice raspy and dry. He waited for thunder. There was only wind. "I gave you everything I could spare," Elian shouted, pulling himself up against the rock. "I followed the rules. I kept the fasts. I paid the tithes. I built a wall of righteousness so high that no one could see inside. And you tore it down." This was the opening of the third room, the room of buried disappointment. For years, Elian had smiled and said, "God is good," while secretly resenting God's demands. He had harbored a deep, festering anger that God had never healed his childhood wounds, never comforted him when his father ridiculed him, and never satisfied the loneliness that drove him to the Roman woman's arms. "Why did you not protect me?" he screamed, picking up a stone and hurling it into the canyon. I tried to be the son you wanted, but you are just like him. You take, and when I stumble, you expose me to the wolves." He fell to his knees, beating the dust with his fists. The polite prayers of the synagogue were gone. The theological debates were gone. This was raw, ugly, and forbidden. He called God a tyrant. He called God a betrayer. He poured out the poison he had kept bottled up for decades. "You could have changed me in private," Elian sobbed, his anger turning into a wail of grief. "Why did you have to ruin me to reach me?" He continued until his voice gave out. He lay panting in the dirt, waiting for the lightning bolt. He had blasphemed. He had accused the Almighty. Surely, now, the ground would open up and swallow him like it swallowed the rebels of old. He closed his eyes and waited for death. But the ground did not open. The sky did not darken. Instead, a strange, heavy silence settled over the canyon. It was not the silence of abandonment. It was the silence of a listener. For the first time in his life, Elian was not performing for God. He was not reciting a script. He was not hiding the ugly parts. He had thrown his worst at the heavens, his hatred, his disappointment, his pain, and God was still there. The realization crept over him slowly, like the cooling shadow of the evening. God had not left. God had not struck him down. The phantom father of his imagination would have beaten him for such insolence. But the true father simply sat with him in the dust, listening to the tantrums of a wounded child. Elian rolled onto his back, looking at the first stars appearing in the twilight. He felt empty, hollowed out, scraped clean of pride and pretense. He had nothing left to protect. The secret room was open. The disappointment was spoken. The performance was over. And in that vast, terrifying emptiness, for the first time, there was room for something else to enter. The sun rose on the third day of Elian's exile in the wilderness. He woke not to the clamor of the city or the anxiety of his former life, but to a profound physical hunger that was strangely liberating. He was empty, utterly and completely broken, yet he felt a flicker of something he had not known since childhood, simple, unadorned peace. He had nothing left to lose. The secrets were public. The money was gone. His reputation was mulch. This utter destitution was the one thing the teacher had asked for, not the selling of his goods, but the complete spiritual bankruptcy that allowed him to finally admit he could not save himself. Elian crawled out of the cave. He found a stagnant pool of water and drank deeply, ignoring the film on the surface. The water was foul, but it sustained him. Then he began to walk, not toward Jerusalem, but deeper into the barren landscape, seeking a place of clarity. He walked until he saw a ridge that offered a view of the distant city. He sat down facing it, and for the first time, he did not look at the city with envy or bitterness, but with pity. He saw the temples, the marketplaces, the magnificent walls, all the structures built by men who believed, as he once did, that perfection and power were protection. He saw the millions of souls locked inside their own self-made secret rooms, desperately trying to manage God through performance. He began to pray, but it was not the formal, rehearsed prayer of the temple. It was a confession born of ruin. "God," Elian whispered, his voice hoarse, "I have sinned against heaven and before you. I kept the rules only to save myself. I hated the law because it demanded a perfection I could not achieve. And I hated you because I believed you were waiting to destroy me." He listed his trespasses out loud, the theft disguised as shrewd business, the adultery concealed by piety, the pride that was the true idol of his heart. He did not ask for his money back. He did not ask for his reputation to be restored. He only asked for one thing. "Lord, I offer you my ruin. I offer you the filth that was exposed, the shame that has stripped me bare. If you can use this emptiness, this failure, then take it. Create in me that clean heart that the rabbi spoke of. I cannot earn it. I can only receive it." As he finished, he thought of the teacher. He remembered the love in Jesus' eyes, a love that saw the mask, but addressed the true man underneath. Jesus had demanded the keys not to punish him, but to free him. The exposure that came from Jared and the Roman soldiers was simply the brutal, necessary consequence of his own refusal to open the door willingly. Elian wept, but these were tears of catharsis, not of despair. He knew that the shame he felt was temporary, the pain of the surgeon's knife cutting away the cancer of self-righteousness. His true life had begun not when he joined the community of believers, but when he had lost everything that allowed him to fake it. He had finally presented his collapse as his offering. Elian spent another night under the stars. The next morning, he felt a strange, quiet conviction rise in his spirit. He knew he could not hide forever. He had to face his failure in the place where it had been most painfully revealed, the community he had lied to. He started the long journey back toward the city, walking slowly, deliberately. He was no longer running from judgment. He was walking toward grace, though he had no idea what that might look like. As he approached the outskirts of Jerusalem, he sought out the tent of a poor man he had once evicted to expand his estate. The man, a simple laborer named Caleb, had reason to hate Elian. Elian found Caleb mending a fishing net by a small fire. He stopped a respectful distance away. Caleb looked up, recognition dawning in his eyes, followed by a hard, flat hatred. "What do you want, Elian?" Caleb asked, his voice low and dangerous. "Are you here to collect the dirt beneath my feet too?" Elian knelt. He did not try to explain or excuse himself. "I am here to confess, Caleb," Elian said simply. "I stole your land, I stole your peace, and I sinned against God to protect my greed. I have lost everything I took from you, and more, but that does not absolve my debt. I am ruined. I have nothing left to give you now except my apology. I beg your forgiveness." Caleb stared at him, stunned. He had expected arrogance, perhaps a veiled threat, but not this absolute surrender. The once mighty Elian was dust. Caleb was a simple man, but he was a man of faith. He saw the truth in Elian's eyes, the utter brokenness that surpassed mere legal penalty. He remembered the teacher's words about forgiveness. "I forgive you, Elian," Caleb said, his voice softer now. "Go and sin no more." The grace was overwhelming. It was a gift, freely given, unearned, and powerful enough to break the final lock on Elian's fear. It was the first human mirror of the divine love he had begun to experience in the desert. He left Caleb and continued toward the city gates. He knew he could never resume his former life, but he knew where he belonged. He went to the place where the believers gathered, the gathering he had fled in terror weeks earlier. He stood outside the door for a long time. Finally, he stepped inside. The apostles were there, Peter, John, and James. Many of the newer believers did not know him, but the core group remembered Elian, the self-righteous, and they certainly knew Elian the ruin. They stopped their discussion, their eyes filled with a mixture of shock and suspicion. Peter, the man whose gaze had condemned Ananias, looked at Elian. Elian waited for the death sentence, waited for the condemnation he deserved. Peter did not speak of the crime, he spoke of the wound. "Elian," Peter said, his voice gentle, "what brings you back to the place you abandoned in fear?" "I came to confess my sin," Elian replied, his voice firm and steady, finally speaking the absolute truth. "I was Ananias. I lied to God with my service. I kept the price of my life for myself. I am here now with nothing. I have nothing left to offer but the broken pieces." Peter walked toward him, not with the coldness of a judge, but with the warmth of a brother. He knew that Elian had passed through the fire. He knew that the shame that had stripped Elian was the very thing that had made him ready. "Welcome home, Elian," Peter said, placing his hand on the disgraced man's shoulder. "The love of God is not found in the temple treasury, but in the hands of the bankrupt." It was in that moment, surrounded by the suspicious and the faithful, that Elian finally felt the spiritual contract dissolve entirely. He was not there to earn salvation, but simply to exist in the presence of unearned love. Elian did not rejoin the believers as a leader or an elder. He came back as a servant, a follower, the least among them. His wealth was gone, but his skills, his literacy, his deep knowledge of the scriptures, his keen understanding of finance were needed by the growing community. He became the community's silent scribe. He managed their charitable accounts, ensuring that every denarius was accounted for, never touching a single coin for himself, utterly transparent in all his dealings. He worked in the shadows, away from the spotlight he once craved, finding contentment in anonymity. The members of the community began to trust him slowly. They saw his diligence, his humility, and the quiet sorrow in his eyes that spoke of a battle fought and won. They saw that the man who had been perfect was now genuinely good. One day, Elian was entrusted with a sacred task, copying the most recent letters from the Apostle Paul to the churches. He sat alone in the evening, carefully dipping his stylus in the ink, translating the thoughts of the energetic apostle. He came to a passage that spoke about the nature of the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. Paul wrote of Moses covering his face with a veil because the people could not look upon the fading glory of God that radiated from him. Then Elian read the next lines, "But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord." Elian stopped writing. The stylus slipped from his fingers, leaving a small blot of ink on the parchment. The veil, he thought. His whole life had been spent constructing a veil, the veil of forbidden rooms. It was the veil of his own false righteousness, the barrier he used to hide his secret ugliness from the world and, more importantly, from God. He had been terrified that if the veil was lifted, he would be struck dead. But the new covenant, the covenant of Jesus, changed everything. The ultimate veil, the curtain in the temple, had been torn from top to bottom at the moment of the teacher's death, signifying that access to God was no longer restricted. And now, Paul was saying that the people who followed Jesus were invited to look upon the unveiled glory of God, not to be destroyed, but to be transformed. The exposure Elian had dreaded was now the means of his salvation. He realized his fear was backward. It was not God's judgment that he had to fear, but God's glory. And glory, in the new age, was not a blinding fire of condemnation. It was the light of transforming love. His ruin was the catalyst. Because his old veil was ripped away by his shame, he could now receive the new life. Elian picked up the stylus again, his heart swelling with conviction. He finished copying the passage, his handwriting more beautiful and steady than ever before. He was no longer Elian the righteous, or Elian the fraud. He was simply Elian, the man whose secret room had been exposed, and whose heart, in its brokenness, was finally beginning to be remade. His journey was not about rebuilding a shield, but learning to live openly, vulnerably, in the terrifying, beautiful light of the unveiled. Years passed, marked not by seasons or festivals, but by the relentless, quiet work of transformation. Elian, the disgraced, was now known simply as Brother Elian, the diligent scribe, the tireless manager of the community's offerings. His face, once taut with the strain of pretense, was now lined with the evidence of true humility and deep, reflective sorrow. He was trusted implicitly, not because he seemed incapable of sin, but because he was so intimately acquainted with his own capacity for failure. He had achieved a genuine, quiet peace, but the scar of his past remained. It was not a hidden wound, it was the essential component of his new identity. His greatest challenge was not future temptation, but the persistent burden of memory. Elian would often sit alone in the evenings, surrounded by the parchments he meticulously copied, and the memories would return. He did not remember the glory of his wealth. He remembered the fear that his wealth created. He remembered the cold dread as he locked the forbidden door. He remembered the look of cold contempt in his earthly father's eyes. These memories were no longer instruments of shame, but tools of empathy. He learned that true repentance did not mean forgetting the sin, but transforming the memory of the sin into a profound resource for compassion. The community brought many problems to the apostles, and often Peter would turn and say, "Brother Elian, you have heard this song before. Speak to them." Workwait. One day, a young man named Silas was brought before the community. Silas had been caught misappropriating funds meant for the distribution of food to the needy. He had not stolen a large sum, but the breach of trust was severe. He stood before the group, defiant and arrogant, refusing to confess fully, claiming the funds were a personal loan that he intended to repay. He was clinging to the last shreds of his reputation, exactly as Elian had once clung to his. Elian looked at Silas, and he did not see a common thief. He saw a terrifying reflection of his former self. He saw the cold calculation, the self-justification, the lie attempting to hide beneath the cloak of technical truth. "Silas," Elian began, his voice calm and steady, stripped of all judgment, "I know what you are doing. You are trying to manage the cost of your failure. You want the community to believe you are simply careless, when your heart knows you are a thief." Silas flinched, stung by the directness. "You are afraid of the shame," Elian continued, leaning forward. "You are afraid that if you tell the whole truth, the terrible, ugly truth of your heart, you will be thrown out, that you will lose your place, that you will be judged as worthless." "I am not worthless," Silas cried out, finally breaking his composure. "I just made a mistake." "I know," Elian said, his voice now gentle. "I am telling you this because I was judged worthless when I was a child, and when I grew into a man, I built a perfect life to prove the world wrong. I built a room in my house that held my shame, and I believed that if anyone saw inside, God would kill me." Elian paused, his eyes unwavering. "I was exposed. I lost everything. I lost my money, my home, my name, and my false perfection. It was the worst thing that ever happened to me, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me." "Silas, do not waste another minute defending the lie. Give them the whole truth. Give them your ruin. If you give them the perfect version of yourself, they will praise the mask. If you give them the failure, they will introduce you to the man who heals the real man underneath." The power of the moment was not in the words, but in the authority of the speaker's lived experience. Silas, seeing the deep, painful scar of truth on Elian's face, crumbled. He fell to his knees and confessed everything, detailing his debts, his fear, and his intention to steal. The confrontation, driven by Elian's compassionate memory of his own failure, ended not in expulsion, but in the painstaking work of restoration and forgiveness. Elian had learned that the memory of his darkest hour was now the single greatest gift he could offer. It was the key, forged in fire, that opened the hearts of others who were still locked in their own forbidden rooms. Elian never regained the social standing of his youth, nor did he seek it. He found his true purpose not on the pedestal of the righteous, but on the floor of the needy. He began to manage the community's relationships with the widows and the Hellenistic Jewish community groups, often neglected or marginalized by the city's power structures. His financial acumen, once used for exploitation, was now used to ensure every distribution was fair, transparent, and generous. He turned the ruthlessness of his former life into relentless service for the vulnerable. One afternoon, he was reviewing the community's accounts, meticulously recording incoming donations. A small leather pouch was passed to him. It contained a handful of copper coins, the smallest donation yet, but given with evident sincerity. Elian recorded the amount, then smiled, recognizing the handwriting on the attached note. It was from Caleb, the poor laborer whose land Elian had once stolen. The note simply read, "For the work of the Lord, with thanks for your service." The copper coins, given by a man who had every reason to despise him, felt heavier in Elian's hand than all the gold he had poured into the temple treasury in his previous life. He realized that this was his true inheritance, not the vast properties he had lost, but the redeemed relationships and the tangible evidence of grace working through his life. Later that week, Peter called Elian aside. The apostle looked weary but filled with a quiet joy. "Elian," Peter said, The persecution against us is rising. We must divide our resources and ensure that the stories of the teacher are recorded before the witnesses are scattered. You have the mind of a scholar and the heart of a servant. We need you to take the apostle John Mark, the young man whose spirit is restless, and use your skills to help him write the record. Elian was astonished. To be trusted with the sacred narratives, the stories of the teacher he had once stood before and rejected, was an honor he felt utterly unworthy of. Peter placed a hand on his shoulder. The teacher did not entrust his story to those who were perfect, Elian. He entrusted it to those who understood failure. John Mark failed once. He abandoned the mission. You failed spectacularly. You are both men who know the cost of turning back, and you both know the terror of the unveiled. You will understand that the gospel is not about the righteous entering the kingdom. It is about the lost being found. Elian accepted the task with trembling gratitude. He and John Mark were an unlikely pair, the disciplined, analytical former scribe and the impulsive, sensitive young man who wrote with the urgency of a man who needed to get the story out. Elian's task was not just to write the words, but to frame the narratives, to understand the context, and to ensure the story resonated with the Jewish background of the readers. He helped Mark shape the account, emphasizing Jesus' authority over the law, over sickness, and over the demonic forces that imprisoned men. One night, as they worked late by the light of a small lamp, Mark read back a passage they had just completed, the story of the rich young ruler. Jesus, looking at him, loved him, and said to him, "You lack one thing. Go, sell all that you have and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me." Mark paused, looking at Elian. "I always wondered what happened to that man." The story ends so abruptly. He walked away sorrowful. Elian looked down at the parchment. His eyes, though tired, were clear. "The story does not end there, Mark," Elian said, his voice barely a whisper. "That man walked away from Jesus, but he walked right into the life he had earned. He walked into ruin, and that ruin, Mark, was the last great gift that forced him to turn around and find the teacher again. Tell the people that the one thing we lack is not perfection, but the courage to admit our ruin. Tell them that the saddest story is the one that chooses the lock over the key." Mark wrote down Elian's words, realizing that the old scribe was not just recording history, he was living the epilogue to one of the teacher's most profound lessons. Elian found his final redemption in becoming the living, breathing witness to the terrible, beautiful grace that saves those who have nothing left to offer but their utter, unveiled poverty of spirit. Time moved differently now. Decades had passed since Elian had walked away from the teacher in sorrow, and many years had passed since he had crawled back to the foot of the cross in ruin. His hair was now the color of the bleached linen he used for his scrolls, and his hands, once steady enough to count gold coins with lightning speed, now trembled with the tremor of age. But his eyes remained sharp, burning with a fire that seemed to grow brighter as his body withered. The church in Jerusalem was under heavy pressure. The Roman authorities had grown suspicious of this sect that refused to call Caesar Lord. Many of the original apostles had scattered to carry the message to the ends of the earth, leaving elders like Elian to anchor the faithful who remained in the city of shadows. One evening, a young man named Titus came to Elian's quarters. Titus was brilliant, wealthy, and charismatic, a mirror image of who Elian had been 40 years ago. Titus was a believer, but he was struggling. He held a position of influence in the local magistrate's office, and he was terrified that his association with the believers would cost him his career. Elian sat on his simple wooden stool, watching the young man pace back and forth. "I can help the church more if I stay in power," Titus argued, his voice tight with anxiety. "If I keep my position, I can protect us. I can influence the laws. But if I admit publicly that I follow the Nazarene, I lose everything. Surely God does not want me to throw away my influence?" Elian listened, hearing the echo of his own voice from a lifetime ago. He heard the same bargaining, the same desire to serve God while keeping the throne of his heart occupied by his own ambition. "Titus," Elian said, his voice raspy but commanding, "you are trying to negotiate a peace treaty between your ambition and your surrender. It will not hold." Titus stopped pacing. "But look at you, Elian. You serve here in obscurity. You write scrolls. I am talking about changing the city." Elian smiled, a sad, knowing smile. I once thought that my wealth was the only thing that made me useful to God, Elian replied. I thought that if I gave him my money, he would not ask for my reputation. But I tell you the truth, God does not need your influence, he needs your death. Titus recoiled as if slapped. Death? Elian leaned forward, resting his weight on his cane. Not the death of your body, though that may come. I speak of the death of the man who thinks he is the owner of his life. You are afraid that if you surrender your position, you will be too late to make a difference. You think that because I surrendered late in life, I wasted my years. Elian gestured to the stacks of parchment around him, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, the records of the martyrs. I gave God my heart when it was already broken, Elian said softly. I gave him the years that the locusts had eaten, the years of my pride, my hiding, my sin. And do you know what he did? He restored them. He did not give me back my money. He gave me something far more dangerous. He gave me a voice that speaks to the secrets of men. Elian stood up, painfully slow, and walked over to Titus. He placed a hand on the young man's shoulder. You are looking at an old tree, Titus. But the scripture says the righteous shall still bear fruit in old age. They shall be fresh and flourishing. My fruit is not power. My fruit is truth. I am a witness that you can lose everything the world values and find that you are richer than Caesar. Titus looked into the old man's eyes. He saw no regret. He saw only a terrifying, beautiful freedom. Do not wait until you are ruined to surrender, Titus, Elian whispered. Do not make God tear down your house to get into your heart. Open the door now. Join the cloud of witnesses who have decided that the approval of God is worth the scorn of men. Titus wept. It was the weeping of a man whose defenses were finally crumbling. That night, Titus did not leave with a strategy to save his career. He left with the resolve to confess his faith to the magistrate the next morning, regardless of the cost. Elian watched him go, knowing that he had just helped another son avoid the decades of wandering that he himself had endured. He realized then that his story of late surrender was not a badge of shame, but a weapon of hope for every generation that followed. The end did not come with violence, nor did it come with the dramatic flair that Elian had once imagined for his life. It came quietly, in the stillness of the night, as a gentle unraveling of the silver cord. Elian lay on his narrow bed. His breathing was shallow, each inhalation a conscious effort. The room was dim, lit only by a single oil lamp that flickered against the stone walls. A few of the younger brothers sat nearby, reading softly from the Psalms, their voices a comforting murmur in the background. But Elian was no longer in the room. His mind was traveling through the architecture of his own soul. For so much of his life, he had imagined his heart as a fortress with locked doors. He remembered the room of hidden sin, where he had kept his idols and his lusts. He remembered the room of shame, where he had stored the memories of his failures. He remembered the room of disappointment, where he had hidden his anger at God. And most of all, he remembered the throne room, where he had sat for so long, clutching the crown of control. In his final moments, Elian walked through the house of his heart one last time. He approached the door where the hidden sins used to be. It was wide open. The darkness was gone. The smell of stale secrets was replaced by the scent of fresh air and grace. There was nothing there to hide. The blood of the Lamb had scrubbed the floorboards clean. He moved to the room of shame. He expected to feel the old pang of regret, the sting of the rich young ruler who walked away. But as he looked inside, he saw only a testimony. The shame had been transmuted into glory. His failure had been the doorway to his salvation. He did not hate the memory anymore. He thanked God for the ruin that had saved him. He walked to the throne room. It was the place he had feared most, the place where he had fought his fiercest battles against surrender. He looked at the seat of authority in the center of his being. It was occupied, but it was not occupied by Elian. It was not occupied by his father's ghost. It was not occupied by fear or money or reputation. Seated there, ruling with absolute, calm sovereignty, was the presence he had once fled from. It was the Spirit of the Son. Elian felt a profound sense of relief wash over him, stronger than the pain in his chest. The war was over. The occupation was complete. There were no more rebels hiding in the corners. There were no more secret treaties with the enemy. The house belonged entirely to the owner. He heard the brothers in the room stop reading. They sensed the change in his breathing. One of them, perhaps young Mark, leaned in close. "Brother Elian," Mark whispered, Are you afraid? Elian opened his eyes one last time. He tried to speak, but his voice was too weak to form the sounds. He wanted to tell them that fear belonged to the man who had something to lose, and he had already lost everything to gain the only thing that mattered. He thought of the question he had asked Jesus so many years ago, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" He realized now that the answer was never about doing. It was about dying. It was about unclenching the fist. It was about unlocking the door. Elian closed his eyes. The image of the earthly father who had rejected him faded into nothingness, replaced by the vision of the Father who had run to meet him while he was still a long way off. He saw the face of the teacher, not as he had seen him in the dust of the road, but unveiled, radiant, and smiling. The teacher was holding a key, but he did not need to use it. "The door is open, Lord," Elian's spirit whispered. "Come in." With a final, gentle exhale, Elian stepped across the threshold. He left behind the veil of forbidden rooms and entered the place where there are no shadows, no secrets, and no shame. The rich young ruler who had walked away sorrowful had finally run home, empty-handed and fully alive.